Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very honored and excited to be here and to be talking to so many people in this very exciting place in the world about my big topic. I chose this very stupid picture here because I wanted to add "and AI" to the title. Nava is obviously much better than me in getting AI to do good pictures. So this was what AI created when I asked it to do a picture of the intersection of creativity, wisdom, and intelligence. And it's so bad that I wanted to show it to you. So I'm not going, and then as you can see, I said, great, thank you, goodbye, and okay. Anyway, so not much more about AI. Basically, I want to tell you a little bit about, first of all, what types of problems require wisdom, because wisdom problems are different from creativity problems or intelligence problems in particular. And then, of course, I want to talk a little bit about why intelligence and creativity are not enough to solve these kinds of problems. I want to give you a little history of the psychology of wisdom, including a little bit, not very technical, on how we try to measure wisdom, because this is still a big problem for us. And then, of course, I want to talk about the things we don't know yet, maybe about some wisdom killers that already have been mentioned, I think. And then, yeah, maybe try to engage you all into a call for collective wisdom. So, here are some examples of problems that require wisdom. You have a conflict with your teenage child who has decided that she wants to move out immediately. This is a very personal conflict, probably very emotional. On the other hand, you might be the head of a big organization and you need to develop an organizational policy that involves somehow making a deal between different stakeholders. You might, on the other hand, be the head of the world and trying to organize a global effort to counteract global warming, which would be very important, but nobody's really doing it very efficiently at the moment. On the other hand, you might just be trying to decide whether you should place your mother in a nursing home for dementia care because it's getting very difficult for yourself. All of these are wisdom problems, but they are obviously very different. You could be at work in the middle of a conflict between members of a team where each side accuses the other of mobbing. All of these different ranges, you can order them. Oh yeah, and then you could be a national leader trying to overcome conflicts, probably not something that's foreign to people living in Israel. In Austria, it's been a lot of post-pandemic conflicts that came up between groups. All of these are wisdom problems, obviously. So, but they are very different, and we can sort of try to order them on this scope continuum from relatively individual problems. Wisdom problems usually involve more than one person. It's not just something within yourself, it's usually something that at least involves decisions that have something to do with other people, but then the scope goes all the way up to global problems. And obviously in some ways dealing with climate change doesn't quite require the same psychological resources as deciding on whether to put your mother in a dementia care home, but on the other hand these problems have some things in common. So most important probably today is the global, or at least the broad side of the problem. So one interesting question is whether the things we already know about individual wisdom on the left side can also apply to the broad global scale. Anyway, so there are three big characteristics of these problems that all of them have in common. The first is that they are complicated and involve different perspectives. The second is that to solve them well, you need to think about something bigger than just yourself. If you do this just for yourself, for your own benefit, then you're probably not being wise. And then, very often in different ways, strong emotions are involved. So let's have a bit of a look at these three aspects. Wisdom problems are complicated. Usually what we would really like to have is some kind of algorithm where you put in all the aspects and then it does some mathematical thing and then it says, okay, the solution is this, but doesn't work. Many people have tried. Wisdom problems are just so complicated, so many things interacting with each other that you often cannot even represent them properly. You cannot even have a nice little clear figure, a graphic that shows all of the aspects. They are multi-perspectival. You have different people with different views and different needs and different values, and somehow you need to deal with all of these different perspectives. You cannot just ignore some of them. You need to somehow balance them if the solution is supposed to be long-term sustainable. And all of this is even more complicated because there are so many things you don't know. There are things you do not know, there are things you cannot know, there are things that are unpredictable. And that's another thing that makes wisdom problems even more complicated. So one thing that comes from this is that you usually do not have a solution ready. You write up your solution and then you do it. Usually the process is very incremental. You start from some kind of good, hopeful perspective, and then you evaluate your progress, and then you find, okay, this is not working at all. Then you shift to something else. So it's very important to maintain an open mind, to be able to see where you're going wrong, and then to change your solution, and then maybe slowly move towards something that will eventually work. So the greater good thing, I think, is very important. This is one thing that we always find in all of our studies. As soon as somebody is doing something just for themselves, it's not wise. We did studies where people were asked to evaluate the actions of some kind of fictional mayor of a little village, and we had different things that we combined. So we were looking at how different aspects of what the mayor was doing and how he was making his decision would affect whether people thought the decision was wise. And one thing was that we asked them, in one condition, the mayor did whatever he did to do the best for his village, and in the other condition, he did it to get re-elected. And whenever the mayor was doing whatever he was doing, when he was doing it just to get re-elected, then it wasn't considered as wise by the participants, even if what he did was perfectly fine. So the non-selfishness is certainly a very big aspect of wisdom. But then the question is, how do we define the greater good? Because usually when you have a conflict, imagine a conflict with just two sides, a political conflict, for example, each side is certainly thinking that they are caring about the greater good, and the other side is evil, right? Many, many times. So both of them have just different ideas about what the greater good is. So before you can say, okay, we're going for a greater good, you first need to decide to find a consensus on what actually the goals are, the greater good goals that you are going for. So one thing that we conclude from that is that it's really, really complicated. But another thing is that we could at least try, when we're trying to find solutions to difficult problems, to start from thinking about, okay, what is the greater good that we want to go for, which people often don't do. And then you have strong emotions. When it's your own mother who has dementia, I've been going through this in the past few months, there's a lot of strong emotions of yourself, right? But then when you are this person who is trying to find a solution to climate change, maybe you have no strong emotions yourself, but there are many other people involved. Your decisions will affect a lot of people, and those people may have strong emotions. So it's really important either to regulate your own emotions when they are so strong that they might overwhelm your thinking, but on the other hand, also to consider the emotions of other people involved, even if you don't really care that much. So emotions are something that is always involved in wisdom problems. So what about intelligence and creativity? We certainly need intelligence. Usually intelligence is defined in many ways, but one basic distinction is what we call crystallized intelligence and what we call fluid intelligence. So fluid intelligence is things like logical reasoning, remembering things, having a good memory, keeping representations of complicated things in your mind, and then reasoning logically about those things. That's certainly something you need when you're dealing with complicated problems. Crystallized intelligence is sort of what has crystallized in your mind from all the experiences you've had in your life, so it's the knowledge that you have. And of course, when you're looking into a complicated problem, you need a lot of knowledge, and usually not just your own knowledge, but you will hopefully ask experts to provide their perspectives, which will again often be conflicting, but you will try to use as much existing knowledge as there is to deal with your problem. So both of these aspects of intelligence are important. But if you think about how we usually measure intelligence, all of you know intelligence tests. It's basically you have this question and then there are maybe 5 solutions and one of them is the right solution. And it's definitely right and the others are definitely wrong. For wisdom problems, you don't have that, right? You don't even exactly know what the problem is. There are many different possible solutions. One of them is better in some aspects, another one is better in other aspects. So there is no one clear-cut solution. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a wisdom problem. Some people have tried to measure wisdom by using intelligence-type tasks, where you describe a difficult problem and then you give 5 possible solutions. Turns out most people can select the wise solution, so they can recognize wisdom, but they cannot actually produce it themselves. So wisdom is about more than just finding the right solution to, let's say, a mathematical problem. Creativity we need, of course, also for complicated problems. We always need new ways of thinking about problems, new perspectives, maybe arranging things in our mind in some new way, bringing in some new approaches. But both creativity and intelligence are obviously not necessarily used for the greater good, right? When we're looking nowadays at the incredible developments in AI and how dangerous they could be for humanity, and the super creative people who have been developing all these approaches, not all of them have really been caring that much about what they could do to humanity, right? So the greater good goals are definitely not part of creativity or intelligence. So I would just briefly like to walk you through a little history of wisdom psychology, just so you see how wisdom has been defined and how has this been evolving over time. It's a relatively young field of psychology. It's funny because for the longest time, nobody would really touch this very complicated thing. It sounded a little esoteric and somehow not like something you could measure or study with our psychological methods. One early exception is Erik Erikson's theory of identity development. He didn't really talk very much about wisdom as a word, but his latest two stages of development, generativity, which relates to what we've been hearing about, like overcoming your own ego, caring about other people, caring about other things, not just doing things for yourself anymore. This is the kind of late midlife stage of life. And then as people are facing the end of their own life, they might reach the phase of integrity, where they are basically at peace with their own life, basically feeling connected to things beyond themselves, and therefore are also able to accept the end of their own life, at least in Erikson's model. So he was kind of talking about wisdom, but he wasn't doing the kind of empirical work where you try to measure something as psychologists like to do. Then from the 80s on, people started looking at how people define wisdom, because they didn't want to really define wisdom as psychologists. The way we say intelligence is this, 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 and this feels a little risky for wisdom, so people started looking into how so-called lay people, which is just non-psychologists, define wisdom. And then this person came along. He's Paul Baltes. He was a very well-known researcher on aging. So he was interested in cognitive aging and other aspects of aging, what changes in your brain and in your ways of thinking as you age. And for a long time, he mostly looked at things that get worse with age, but then he was very much looking for some way of thinking that might actually come with age. And so, of course, wisdom was a logical place to go. So he was coming very much from developmental psychology. And in the time he started, the late 80s and early 1990s, a lot of people were investigating expert knowledge. So you could be an expert in chess. A lot of people study chess or mathematics, things where you can be an expert, where you become an expert by just really training hard and practicing hard. So if you want to be a really good chess player, the literature says you have to invest, I think, about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, which means you really train yourself, you do difficult things, you don't do easy things, you try to always do something that's a little too difficult for you, and you explicitly try to train yourself for chess. So Paul Baltes was applying this approach to wisdom. He said wisdom is expert knowledge about the big problems of human life, the meaning and conduct of life. So basically the idea was, if you want to be wise, you practice just like you would practice chess. And I think being a psychotherapist, for example, could probably be considered as some very good wisdom training. The interesting thing about the expertise that you gain when you try to be wise, when you work towards wisdom, it's a good question whether wisdom really comes from working towards wisdom, but one interesting aspect of this expert knowledge is that it includes so much awareness of its own limitations. A wise person will always know how many things they don't know, and how another person might see things completely differently. And that's kind of unusual in the field of expertise. Usually experts know what they know. Wise people very much know what they don't know. So how do you measure this kind of expert knowledge? Paul Baltes developed the first method for really measuring wisdom. It was used mostly only at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin because it is a super expensive method, because it requires interviews and then transcription of the interviews, and then a number of people have to rate those interviews. And what they would do is really use short little descriptions of life problems, such as this one: a 15-year-old girl wants to move out from the family home immediately. what could be considered and done in such a situation. And then he would have people just talk and talk, say everything that came to their mind about this problem. And then the responses would be transcribed and rated for 5 different criteria. And the first 2 were just classical expertise criteria, so they would be about knowledge. Factual knowledge, what does the person know about 15-year-old girls, and about puberty maybe, and about family relationships. Procedural knowledge, how do you deal with 15-year-old girls? What could you do in a situation like this? How could a 15-year-old girl even move out from home from a legal perspective? Things like that. But the more important wisdom criteria were the ones you see here below, which were really what he called meta criteria, because they were about not knowing. They were about being aware of the fact that the family of the 15-year-old girl might have very different values from the person who is responding. The girl has different perspectives and different goals and needs than their parents have, probably. Contextualism, he called it lifespan contextualism, but I think it's contextualism very generally. In what context does the family live? What resources do they have? What culture do they even live in? What's the family structure? Where does the situation come from? And then, very importantly, awareness of uncertainty. Just knowing and making clear how many things cannot be known. So a wise person's response would be pretty long, and it would be very much about all the different aspects that need to be considered and all the many things that we don't know when we know just 1 or 2 sentences about the problem. Okay, so that's a way to measure wisdom. And a lot of studies were done with this approach, showing interesting things, such as that wisdom does not generally increase with age. It seems to be increasing mostly in young adulthood, then stay stable, and maybe decline a little bit in very old adulthood, but that's not quite clear. That might be a measurement problem. And then came people like Monica Arnold. She's a sociologist, actually. She's working in Florida, and she's funny because she has this strong German accent, even after now living 30 years in America. And in her strong German accent, she started traveling around and criticizing the Max Planck Institute heavily. And I think she was very right with what she did. She wrote this critique where she basically said, everything fine, it's okay what they are doing, but they are not really looking at people, at individuals, and how individuals develop wisdom. Because they say a person develops wisdom not by reading about wisdom, but by experiencing things. And the experiences have to be so strong that they actually change the person. And so wisdom is very much a personality transformation thing. If you only experience something and don't really reflect on it, don't really change because of it, then you haven't gained wisdom. The Berlin approach would basically allow for wisdom to be just learned from books. And Monica says this is not happening, not working. So she says wisdom is a personality quality. And she says it's actually a combination of 3 different personality dimensions, she calls them. One is the cognitive dimension, and she doesn't really say it's about knowledge, but it's about wanting knowledge, about a desire to learn and understand. If your personality really makes you curious about wisdom, if you really care about understanding life and understanding people and understanding yourself, then you are very likely to develop the kind of expert knowledge that the Berlin people talk about. But the core, the root of wisdom is really this personality quality. And then she says the second important thing, which also contributes to this kind of knowledge, is the reflective dimension, which just basically makes you willing and able to look at things from different perspectives, which also includes looking at yourself from different perspectives, being critical of yourself, seeing how different people might see things very differently than you do, and trying to identify your own biases, your own problems in your own thinking, trying to be self-critical and self-aware. And then maybe, I think even most important, she says the third dimension of wisdom is the affective dimension, which is really just caring about people. She actually says it's love for others. I think it might sometimes be okay to just care enough to want others to be okay. You don't have to love all of them, but there's, I guess, a lot of differences to talk about that. But sympathetic and compassionate love for people, she says, is a personality dimension that will make people wise over time. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So how do you measure personality? In psychology, we usually measure personality by simply using self-report scales, as we call them, and there could be some statements like this, and you would just have to say to what extent you agree to each of these statements. So one of them that almost everybody agrees to is, when I'm upset about somebody, I usually try to put myself in their shoes for a while. And we all say we do this, but then when you think back about the last conflict you maybe had with somebody, you may find out you actually didn't do it, but we like to think that we do it. So that's a big problem, I think, with self-report scales in general. And then the other sentences that you have here are all items that are coded for non-wisdom. So not agreeing to these other sentences would be wise. I am annoyed by unhappy people who just feel sorry for themselves. This is certainly something a wise person wouldn't say. A wise person would say, okay, I'm compassionate with these people because they are depressed or they have other good reasons to feel sorry for themselves. People are either good or bad would be an example of the cognitive dimension. Anyone who agrees to that would certainly be not wise, right? Would be ignoring all kinds of reasons why people could be acting in a way that others perceive as not so good or not so bad. I would feel much better if my present circumstances change. This is again a reflectiveness item. The idea is that if you are a reflective person, you see your own role in your circumstances and you don't sort of blame your situation on others. I'm not so sure about this one, but just to show you some examples. So most of the scale consists of statements that wise people would not agree to, so you basically get sort of a negative score, but you just really sum up people's responses to all these items, which has the advantage of being way easier than what the Berlin group did, but it has the disadvantage of basically just showing what people think about themselves and not maybe how people really are, because especially not very wise people may be very wrong about whether they really put themselves in other people's shoes and things like that. Anyway, so this is my all-time favorite wisdom researcher, Rick Levinson. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, and he really sort of comes back to what has been discussed earlier. He says the main aspect of wisdom is really overcoming the ego, transcending the self, not just everything being about yourself anymore. And I assume all of us know people who even people who seem to be very wise, but you can sort of tell that they are just being wise because they want to be seen as this wise person, right? So it's all really just about them. And a truly wise person wouldn't care about themselves. They would really be trying to be there for others. They would not see rigid boundaries between selves and others. They would be very much connected to other people, to future generations, to the world at large, to nature, and so on. So Rick said there are 4 levels of development towards self-transcendence, and this is based on a lot of literature, also from Buddhist traditions. So the first thing is to know yourself well, including the things about yourself that are not so great, and then to also accept these things and integrate them into yourself. In between, there's non-attachment, which means not being attached to all those external things that may define a self, such as being rich, being powerful, being famous. So the true core of yourself being inside you and independent of these external things. Then you integrate your strengths and your weaknesses and everything into accepting who you really are. And once you have accepted who you really are and you're at peace with yourself, you don't care about yourself that much anymore. So then you overcome your own ego and you reach the state of self-transcendence. And he also has a scale. I think I don't have any items here, but his scale has items such as I feel connected to future generations, or I can learn a lot from others. And the beautiful thing about this scale is that some people don't even understand really what it's saying, and so they say no. And so it actually measures quite nicely whether you have reached certain stages, just because if you haven't reached them, you don't really understand what it's saying. Okay, and then we have developmental models. One of them I have developed, and one is by Jeffrey Webster. And this is not incompatible with any of the other models. None of these things are really incompatible. They are all just different perspectives on the same thing. But we were most interested in how wisdom actually develops. And in different ways, but kind of similar, Jeff and our group are both saying that what makes you wiser is really going through challenging life experiences. Experiences that somehow challenge how you have been thinking about life, what you have been taking for granted, And anything that kind of challenges that can make you wiser. It doesn't have to be a negative experience. Becoming a parent, for example, is for many people something that challenges a lot of what they have been thinking before and also has the potential to make you a lot wiser. But then not everybody who becomes a parent becomes wiser, unfortunately. So the main issue is really reflecting on the experiences in ways that can make you wiser. And we have looked into how people actually reflect on experiences and found that what we call exploratory reflection, really trying to understand what happened there, what does it mean for me, how should it maybe change how I live my life. That's the type of reflection that can make you wiser. Often, especially when negative things happen, people try to reflect on a way that just makes the problem go away. So we had some interesting interviews with people who had gone through a very heavy illness, like having cancer or something, and many of them were super understandably saying, okay, I'm fine now, I just don't want to think about it anymore. I basically want to go back to where I was before, which makes perfect sense. But others were saying, okay, I've been thinking about now having learned that my life is obviously going to end, but now I know for more certainty that my life is going to end. What does this mean, right? How should I live my life differently? How should I maybe do more things, be more with people who I like to be with, change maybe what I'm doing in my career, things like that. And that might be the way that also moves you toward more wisdom. And for a long time, we were focusing on internal resources such as openness, being open to new ideas, being able to regulate emotions, caring about other people. And these resources certainly help people become wiser as they think about life experiences. But then our studies have also been showing that other people can be super important mentors that help people grow towards wisdom, as you can certainly all imagine. So wise mentors, again, psychotherapists, people who are just friends, who may be telling you sometimes not just what you want to hear, but also something that you really should hear, can really help people grow wiser as they deal with experiences. Anyway, so then came this guy, Igor Grossman, around 2010, and he changed our thinking about wisdom quite fundamentally by saying, well, okay, yeah, fine, but it's not like a continuum where some people are wise and some people are not wise. If I had more time, I would have done a little survey with you online where I would have asked you, when in your life did you do something particularly wise? And then when in your life did you do something particularly unwise? And probably all of you would have come up with examples of both of these things, right? So we are sometimes wise and sometimes we are not wise, and that's probably true for everybody. And wiser people just have a distribution across situations where they are wise a little more often, but even very wise people sometimes are not quite as wise. So the idea is really wisdom can be a state more than a trait, right? A certain mindset where you're, as has been also described by Nava earlier, the type of flexible mind where you're able to listen to other people, to consider different aspects, and to really be open to the world. Igor has been showing that wisdom can be a state mostly by showing that really simple instructions can make people wiser, at least in the short term, can help people think more wisely. I'll show you examples in a moment. The other evidence that this is based on is really that most people can recall very wise and very unwise things they did in their lives. We can also find that wisdom just varies by context. Some people are very wise in a certain context because they know a lot about that context, and very unwise in some other places. And even if I would ask you to tell me 2 stories from your life about 2 difficult conflicts that you've had, the chances are high that you might be talking much more wisely about one of the conflicts than about the other, which we have found with most people. So even as we think back at a certain point in our lives, we are not thinking back with a certain level of wisdom. How wisely we think about different things seems to also be influenced by, for example, who we have talked to about these events, how we have reflected on them. So even our thinking is not always equally wise at any given point in time. So wisdom is just quite a bit situation dependent, not completely. Wiser people are wiser across more situations than very unwise people, but there's a lot of variability across situations. For example, so these are like little things you might take home with you. One study by the Berlin group actually has shown that people respond more wisely to problems like the one with the 15-year-old girl if they imagine discussing the problem with someone they know for 10 minutes before responding. And then they have a little time to just think about what, actually the other thing is they tried out what happens if people actually discuss the problem with someone they brought along to the lab, and that doesn't seem to increase wisdom, only if you have time to think about the conversation a little bit after it happened. But the other thing, if you just imagine discussing the problem with someone you know, that seems to be helpful to wisdom quite immediately. Then Igor did a study in 2008, before the election that made Barack Obama president, where they asked people in the United States who were very strongly pro-Obama or very strongly against Obama, and they asked them what would happen if the candidate you want to win does not win the election. So very, very scary perspective for the participants, but they asked him to once think about it. One group thought about this from their own perspective, and the other group was asked to think about the perspective, the problem from an Icelander's perspective, which is just very far away for Americans. And the interesting thing was that people who were just taking the perspective of someone very far away were talking much more wisely and less emotionally about what would happen if the candidate wins that they don't like. Then, obviously, we all know this probably. If you have a problem and it's really driving you crazy, and you try to imagine what you would say if somebody else had the problem. If a good friend had the same problem, what would you say to them? Sometimes you are telling the friend very wise things that somehow you're not telling yourself, right? So this is also another easy way to increase your wisdom a little bit. Imagine what you would be saying to someone else having the problem. And then finally, and a little strangely, I think, I still can't really believe it, but they find it again and again. People reason more wisely when they reason in third-person language. So if you're thinking about the problem that you have, not thinking I and me, but thinking she or he, this alone seems to be enough to sort of distance you from yourself to an extent that actually makes you reason more wisely. And they've even done a study where they found that doing this in diary form for a month, constantly trying to, I think every day, even having a diary where you actually write about what happened and what sense you make of it in the third person, that seems to actually have the potential to become a habit that then also helps you in your everyday life, reason more wisely. So a lot of nice things that you can try. Anyway, the point is really doing any of these things can immediately make us a little bit wiser, which means that, interestingly, we have a lot of wisdom-related knowledge in your head, such as we can imagine what another person would be saying, but we don't usually use it, which is really interesting, I think. So anyway, how do you measure wisdom as a state? And this is my good friend Justin Brienza, and he has developed a situated wise reasoning scale. And again, if we had a little more time, I would have asked you the same questions in two different ways. So maybe I would ask you first, how often when you're in a conflict do you put yourself in the other person's shoes? And most of you would probably say very often. And then I would say, okay, now think back about a conflict you had in the past year or half year, and what you did, how you dealt with the conflict, to what extent did you actually put yourself in the other person's shoes? And then it's often like, oh, well, in that conflict, maybe not so much. So they do that. They ask people to think about concrete conflicts and then to basically just rate different types of wise reasoning, such as double-checking whether my own opinion might be correct, trying to look for a compromise, considering alternative ways the situation might play out. And people usually think they would do that, but then when they think about an actual conflict, not so much. And this, of course, is another way to measure wisdom. If you ask people the same questions for maybe like 4 different situations from their lives, then you would get something like an average that may represent wisdom states, a kind of an average across wisdom states that might then also be an indicator of wisdom as a more stable trait. So if anybody is really interested in doing wisdom research, we have this nice little OSF thing where you can download all these different measures and try them out yourself. Right, and now I'm happy to share the slides if this is, yeah, okay, so we can also share the link. So most recently, and I'm not going through all of these models, some people, including us, have tried to overcome this thing we've had for a long time, where there were like 5 different wisdom models, the ones I just showed you, and every research group was using their own model and their own measures, and so sometimes we would have conflicting results about seemingly simple things, such as how does wisdom change with age? You can find everything. You can find increases with age, you can find decreases with age, you can find increases until middle age and then decreases. You even find the opposite pattern, and all of that has been found just with different measures of wisdom. And that's not very satisfactory as a state of research. So several people have been trying to develop integrative models. And I'll show you a little bit of our model and a little bit of the Sternberg and Karami model. Grossman and colleagues have developed what they call a common denominator model, which just basically summarizes the things that everybody agrees upon are part of wisdom, and then there's more. We try to integrate also things that not everybody agrees upon. So this is just a picture to show you the idea of our model. You probably know the story of the blind man and the elephant. So the blind man wants to understand what an elephant is. An elephant is very big, like wisdom. So everybody can just touch a little part of the elephant. And parts of the elephant is pretty different whether you are touching a leg or a tusk or the trunk. So people get a quite different idea of what wisdom is, even though all of these things are part of wisdom. And that obviously makes sense for wisdom as well. When you think about the models that I showed you, adults' personality dimensions contribute to developing Baltus's expert knowledge, and our developmental models maybe explain how some people actually develop the expert knowledge. So they're all complementary rather than really contradictory. So we're trying to integrate all of these components from all of the models in this kind of elephant, and it was quite an elephant to get this paper done. But for here, I just want to say that our basic idea is that there are two groups of wisdom components which are related, and one is the cognitive components and the other is non-cognitive components. And in fact, it's actually more complicated. Most of the non-cognitive also involves some thinking, but this is just to try to kind of separate them. So one important cognitive component is obviously knowledge that is based on experience. There's a lot of discussion about whether the experience has always have to be first-hand, your experience, or whether you can also grow wiser from accompanying other people through difficult experiences, which I very much think is the case. And then, in addition to knowledge and experience, the metacognitive capacities that show you the limits of your knowledge and experience, right? Wisdom, as I said before, wisdom knowledge always involves knowing what you don't know and what you can't know, knowing that there are different perspectives that are all legitimate on an issue, knowing that you cannot control everything. That's a big part of wisdom. And self-reflection goes along sort of logically with this. If you know that there are many things you don't know, if you know that you have a lot of biases yourself, then you will also be trying to reflect on them. And these cognitive components are very much influenced by the non-cognitive components. Exploratory orientation just basically means wanting to understand life, being curious about life. Some people are not interested in life very much. They want to understand how car motors work or how mathematics works, which is both totally fine, but you are going to probably learn more about life if you really have this kind of curiosity. If you want to understand, you don't just want to win the argument, you really want to understand something. Concern for others is obviously very important. Self-transcendence, compassion for others, the greater good orientation that I talked about before. People who don't have that don't have wisdom. I think in this case, it's really that simple. And then emotion regulation, which can mean different things. There are some people who are just calm by nature. My husband, for example, he's this kind of guy. He had this very stressful job, and in the evening he would come home and tell me a little bit about his stressful day, and then he would go to bed and fall asleep. And I would be lying there and thinking about his stressful day for hours. So he just has this kind of natural calmness. If you don't have that, though, then you can learn a lot from developing emotion regulation skills, using maybe some of the techniques that you've also been talking about. So this is something that can both be innate and learned. And I actually do think paying attention to emotions, taking emotions seriously is very important for developing wisdom. But of course, also being able to kind of regulate them. So the interesting thing is how these two work together. Because if you imagine being in a really super complicated, stressful situation, your 15-year-old teenager telling you that she wants to move out from her home right now. Obviously, your non-cognitive components will be challenged, right? You might not be very curious to understand exactly why she wants to do that. You might not be, well, you might be concerned very much for her well-being, but not in the way she thinks would be good for her. And you will probably have difficulty regulating your emotions, right? And these non-cognitive components will limit your access to your cognitive components. So that's why you might be much wiser when you're telling a good friend, when you're trying to give a good friend advice for dealing with their 15-year-old daughter than when you're talking about your own 15-year-old daughter, right? Because the emotions just get so much stronger, and the emotions can get in the way of wisdom. So the basic idea is you are faced with a difficult situation, and then the level to which you have these non-cognitive components will determine to what extent you are able to maintain a wise mindset and to be able to listen and to actually take care of the other person's needs and to remain calm yourself. And only if you are able to do that to a certain extent, you will be really able to use all the knowledge that you may have. Because you may be this super wise person in theory, and if I've seen some of these people, super wise in theory, but when life gets complicated, then you just don't have access to your own knowledge and your own thinking. So, the other important model is by my good friend Bob Sternberg, and he did something very different. He didn't really say he wants to define wisdom, he tried to structure the field of wisdom. So he used something from creativity research, where they long ago already distinguished between creativity problems, the purpose of creativity, creative persons, and creative processes. And he took it a little further because Bob likes to do things like that. He said we don't need 4 Ps, we need 6 Ps for wisdom. So the first are problems that require wisdom, and I told you about which characteristics problems have that require wisdom, so we know quite a bit about that. The purpose of wisdom is to probably achieve some greater good in the face of complex problems, so we can probably agree on that. Wise persons have been studied quite a bit by wisdom psychology, so we know that wisdom goes along with openness to experience, life experience, a certain amount of intelligence, things like that. So, okay, we know a bit about wise persons. Products of wisdom could, for example, be responses to wisdom problems like the one about the 15-year-old girl. They could be solutions to complicated political problems. I think we can tell when we look at products to quite a good extent whether they are wise based on what we know in wisdom research. The problem is we know very little about the processes underlying wisdom. How does the wise person do that? How do they actually manage to ask the right questions, to get the right understanding of the problem, to actually balance different aspects, to define the greater good? And that's something I think we really, really need to understand more. So we need cognitive psychologists, we need people from other fields, we need qualitative researchers who actually look into how do people, how do groups, how do governments, whoever, achieve wise solutions. What are the processes you need for that? And then the other thing that I think is super interesting and important is the contextual and situational presses that make us sometimes act wisely and sometimes act not wisely, not because we are wise or not wise, but because the situation maybe requires us to do something that's really not wise in some cases. And I think that's something we very much need to understand. So let's start with the processes. How do you negotiate a conflict wisely? Big question in Israel, I guess, but in many other parts and on all different scales everywhere in the world. How do you ask questions when a group has some kind of difficult group conflict and you need to figure out what the conflict even is? What questions do you need to ask? How do you regulate emotions in these situations? And as I'm sure you understand, you can imagine, psychology has done a lot of work on these questions. Work psychology, organizational psychology, emotional psychology, and all of this can contribute to wisdom psychology, hopefully learning more about how these different things from very different lines within psychology can be integrated for us to understand how we could maybe really deal with real life problems. So this is just a little table that Justin and I made where we basically list all the different fields of psychology that might be relevant for understanding wisdom better. And the paper that we wrote is really just an invitation for psychologists from all fields to come and join the quest for wisdom. So the other thing, and I think that maybe even more, a little bit more important, is things that influence wisdom positively or very often negatively. Why do people so often act unwisely in the big as well as in the small scale? And time pressure seems to be one thing. We did an experiment where people who thought they were under time pressure argued a lot less wisely. Role pressure. If you're a teacher and you're supposed to know everything, and then it turns out the kids ask you questions because they seem to know more than you. If you're a wise teacher, you will say, okay, that's great, let me learn from you. If you're a not so wise teacher, you might be very stressed out and you might just start saying, okay, I don't care about what you're saying, I'm right? And that's not going to make the kids happy and it's not going to make you a wise person. Group pressure, obviously. can be something that very much works against wisdom. Non-wise external goals. If you're working in a company and the only goal of the company is to maximize profit, you won't be able to act very wisely, even if you know what you would need to be doing. Or if you're just in an argument and you just want to win, right, which often happens. People don't want to really understand why they are wrong. They need to win the argument maybe because their boss is listening or whatever, right? Then you're not going to think deeply and understand and become wiser. Interestingly, having a lot of power seems to be not exactly good for wisdom in many cases because it tends to isolate you from criticism. Nobody will tell you why you're wrong anymore. Also because you start thinking you are the greatest and the smartest and the wisest. Probably something that's very anti-wisdom. Generally, we've been doing experiments where we try to show, haven't really figured it out yet, that people who are very sure that they are right are very unlikely to reason wisely. And then, of course, you can have reward systems that reinforce the wrong things. If you just think about how academia, how universities tend to select professors, how we tend to reward things, how we reward scientific work, it's often just the number of publications and the number of publications in high-level journals, and that might not be the metric that really makes for the wisest behavior. Right, thank you. So here are some wisdom killers in our today's world. I mean, I'm sure you can all think about wisdom killers. One certainly is populist politics. We are seeing in many countries in the world right now, where you basically, one thing that you do is you promise a really simple solution to a really complicated problem, and everybody is really happy to hear that after all, it's so simple. And nowadays with social media, of course, you can do this very effectively. It's always good for populist politics to have some group that you can blame on everything, right? And in that way, of course, you are stoking hate and fear and all these kinds of reflexes that will make many other people unwise in addition to the politician themselves. Yeah, and then of course, I do think that social media and AI-based algorithms within social media are really a major factor in making the world less wise at the moment. If you're interested in this, there's an excellent book by Max Fisher called The Chaos Machine, where he really shows with a lot of examples things like when Facebook came to a certain country at a certain point in time, within a few years you had major conflicts between groups that were really stoked by the kind of algorithms and the kind of reinforcement mechanisms that social media produces. The fact that social media is kind of a safe space for hate, right? You can hate people, you can write hate messages to people without looking into their eyes. Algorithms that will always prioritize content that makes you highly emotional, right? Because that makes you stay longer. And that's just very, very dangerous for society. No distinction, no truth anymore, right? No media where you can really trust that they are telling you the truth. I mean, there are still media that you can trust, but many people get all their information from TikTok these days, actually. Plus, of course, the constant distraction that many of us are probably familiar with. So social media, the way it is now, can probably really be viewed as a major wisdom killer. I believe there could be ways social media could function differently. If you had something like not thumbs up or thumbs down, but something where you would actually rate statements that people make for wisdom, right, or for balance, that might actually have a reinforcing effect on wisdom of content, so that it would be possible, I think. Originally, the internet was created to give all the world access to information, which is an absolutely great thing, right? But look what it has become, yeah. Cognitive biases that we all have. We have in-group, out-group biases. We have this very strong tendency to feel that we are part of a group and to less like people who are part of another group. We have confirmation biases, which have already been mentioned. We like to hear stuff that confirms what we already thought. We don't like to hear stuff that challenges what we've been thinking, so we don't listen to it. And of course, on social media, it's easy to just read stuff and listen to stuff that confirms what you've already been thinking, and then you start believing that the whole world thinks like that. Simplicity bias, again, we like to hear simple solutions. It makes us feel like the world is not so complicated after all. Group conformity, and so on. And then obviously a big thing is what goals and values we live in our societies, right? And what goals and values we teach our children. So if power, money, being in authority, being in power is the main thing we want in life, if we want to win every argument, this is just very, very detrimental to wisdom. So there's one question also, how you can change goals in a society, right? How can we change the goals that we teach our children? Right, possible interventions, and I've just been collecting a little bit of things that have been out there and things that we are thinking about. So one thing is obviously to start with children, right? And Bob Sternberg has been writing for a long time about how education has been more and more focused on just knowledge and teaching to the test and just basically teaching children mathematics and then testing them for mathematics and nothing else. He actually, the paper that I'm citing here, the chapter is about an analysis he did of reading textbooks for elementary school children. And he looked at, I think, textbooks from his parents' childhood, his own childhood, and now his children's childhood. And he found that the stories that are being told are more and more about doing what you yourself want and less about helping others. Really little stories for elementary school children about, I don't know, how the dog helps the cat versus how the dog tells the cat to go away. And it seems that over the years, the stories have really changed towards really just thinking about what you actually want and getting it. Not sure it's just 3 textbooks from the United States, but there might be something to it. So what are we telling children? One thing that's interesting is that teaching wisdom as a theoretical subject, like geography or biology, doesn't seem to work. It seems to have to be something that we actually relate to students' lives. You would have to actually really talk to them about the things they are facing in their lives, which might be a good idea anyway in school, I guess. The other thing is, I guess, wisdom is most easily learned by having models of wisdom, right? So do we allow teachers, do we actually help teachers to be models of wisdom themselves? Do we have a school system that actually models wisdom, including the goals that we teach our children? And then, of course, you can teach things like mindful media use, which might be very important. Many young people would like to have more of that. How do we teach adults? So one thing is we can just communicate the simple strategies that I told you about. Imagine talking to someone else before you respond to a difficult problem. One thing we've been trying to do in a number of studies is to gamify wisdom strategies. We did this fun little app for people that they do in diets where they actually play little games together and then share the results of the games and then learn a little bit about the other person. And this has turned out to be really quite efficient in making people wiser, so you can make wisdom games. We are now running a larger project about whether video games can make people wiser by immersing them in stories that actually tell them important things. And then we're thinking about developing AI-based wisdom support systems, such as an oracle that you can go to and just ask questions, and the oracle will just ask you questions about the problem that you have. And AI might be very good at asking the right questions if we can train it to do that properly. So the other thing is, okay, this is the individual level. We can try to make individuals wiser. But I think it would be very important to also work on other levels. There's a lot of research on group wisdom, maybe not always under the name of wisdom, but it turns out that groups, if they work together well, can be a lot smarter than the smartest individual member of the group, even if it comes to just little intelligence measures. But only if the group members all have to contribute something, so they have to have different perspectives. If everyone has the same perspective, they won't be wiser than any individual of them. But if they have very different backgrounds, very different knowledge, very different perspectives, they can put it together and integrate it into something wiser. Only, though, if they actually have a culture in the group that values these different perspectives. Because as you can imagine, as we all know, probably very often in a group, one person will just lead the discussion and the others will say, yes, yes, sure, fine. And then the group is not going to be wiser than that one person. And groups don't naturally seem to develop these wisdom-fostering cultures. But in medicine, for example, there's a lot of development in this direction, where when you have like complicated patients with complicated multiple illnesses, you will have a case conference where not only doctors from the different domains, but also psychologists, social workers, other nurses, everybody involved in the treatment will come together and have this conversation where all voices are heard and where it actually really helps improving care. And important in the United States, make care even cheaper because they take care of these people better and they don't keep coming back to the hospital all the time. There's quite some literature on that. And another example is what we are hoping for, which is a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration on making wisdom more accessible. Yeah, fine. So, organizations. When you look at a university, let's say, for example, or some other organization, how can you have governance structures that actually enable wisdom? In a university, you could say in every committee that makes decisions about the university, you want one member from every different faculty, depending on the size of the university. You want women, you want men, you want people at different levels of career. And so you can try to make sure that the committees have heterogeneous perspectives. You can evaluate reward systems. Can we reward other things than just the number of papers in high-level journals? In other areas, such as social media, can you create feedback systems that reward balance instead of just going yes or no, right? So these are all things that we can think about. The one thing where I know nothing that we could do, because also I'm just a psychologist, but that's the thing that might be really important. We need global collaboration these days, right? This is a founding charter of the United Nations, which was founded in 1945 in San Francisco after the impression of the Holocaust and after a very strong commitment of many, many nations in the world that this must never happen again. And if you read it, it's really all about trying to collaborate wisely across the globe. And now, well, it was founded for this purpose, and when you think about the second half of the 20th century, in many countries this was a long period of peace, and it saw tremendous growth, of course, in intelligence, in creativity, in technology, in wealth across many countries of the world. And here we are where we are now, and I don't have to tell you in this country how crazy the world has become. So the big question, I think, really is, can we scale wisdom to a level where we globally collaborate? Just think about climate change in addition to all the political issues. If we want to tackle climate change, we need to collaborate globally. And I, for one, don't see this happening at all at the moment, right? So the question is really, do we need more catastrophes? Israel has had a major catastrophe not long ago. Will we need more of that to get to a wiser place, or will we be able to do it any other way? And I think what you are doing here is extremely, extremely important in helping us maybe not having to go through all the catastrophes to get there. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank all the people who have worked with me over the years.
So thank you, Judith. Thank you so much for coming.